simplicity and all that. Thanks for braving the weather this evening. And my gosh, we're Oklahomans, and some people who lived in other places that had, this kind of weather and actual snow and ice and other things. And so I'm glad you all are here. So this is going to be a little different tonight from the first two. I'm going to have a lot less in PowerPoint. I just don't want to keep referring to it, frankly. I'm going to start with a summary, just a very brief summary of where I think we've been over the last couple of weeks, or at least the major points I thought I was trying to make. And you tell me, you can say, bam, did you? At least put out there. Make might be a little strong at times. And then the rest of this tonight is going to be personal. It's going to also be the most pointed, I think, of anything I've had to say. And this is very much, do I just need to be closer still?
You need to swallow it.
All right, that's fine.
We didn't get a lot last week.
Okay, good. This could be a little bit, I think that I can hear that stronger. It's going to be much more personal and pointed this week. And I think that's just because where we're at. I'm trying to be as honest as I can. You are completely free to disagree with me. This is the week I'll say, and the point of view you're going to be getting this week is from Gary Peluso-Verdend. It does not necessarily represent the staff and other constituencies of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. All right. Let's start with a summary of what I think we've been at in the last couple of weeks. First, some of the major changes, movements, I think we've seen since World War II in terms of religion and society and religion and politics in this country. The movement in the second half of the 20th century and the opening of the 21st century has been dominated by centrifugal forces, both worldwide and in the U.S. The centrifugal forces, those that spin out. Usually when I'm trying to figure out what's going on in terms of social dynamics, try to pay attention to as many levels as possible. And I think it's really important to look at the dynamics of societies on planet Earth, especially when you start getting 50, 60, 70 years distance, you can actually start seeing what might have been going on. The forces that seem to be polarizing or pulling people apart in some ways are not brand new, and they're not Northern Hemisphere, Euro-American specific. This is really a worldwide phenomenon. I know I said this at least was probably in week one when I quoted the anthropologist Clifford Geertz that the modern world means that no one will ever leave anyone alone ever again. And we're not really happy about that. A phrase I heard in the recent years is we're at war with our own diversity as humankind. We're trying to figure this out, and we certainly don't have it down. That's one issue. Another issue we talked about is that Christianity in the United States, largely speaking, has been divided by the same social issues as the nation has faced. It's not that we got things right and the culture got it wrong. Because even that distinction between church and culture, we're so interpenetrated. So, race. It was certainly never stopped being an issue throughout the century, and it has certainly not stopped. We are not in a post-racial America. We are not in a post-racial church. W.E.B. Du Bois in the early 20th century said, that the color line was the issue of the 20th century. It has not stopped being the issue. Second issue that has divided both church and nation is around sexuality. This heteronormativity as there being only one kind of acceptable sexuality, either in society or in church, has been challenged constantly, especially from the late 1960s on. And again, talking mostly about the United States. And when did the United Methodist Church first start debating homosexuality? 1972. Every single general conference, every 4 years ever since, which means in subsequent, it wasn't just every 4 years, it was, consistently ever since. Gender and gender roles. We first started ordaining women in the Methodist Church, and I think it was what, 1956? But women first really started coming into ministry in any numbers. There were a few brave souls in the 1970s. But by the time I was graduated seminary in 1981, for mainline denominations, more. Maybe a third women by that point, at least in the north. I know it's been a little more of here in the south, more men than women. In the north, it's really, I think, more women than men. And in seminary like Phillips, we've been at somewhere between 45 and 55% of the population, student population being women for quite some years now. But gender and gender identity, very much one of those issues that society has not decided on. The church have certainly not completely decided on. One of the things I'm quite interested in seeing is after the special general conference and then whatever the aftermath of that is, kind of what also happens in terms of women in ministry, which I'm not 100% convinced will stay exactly the same, except for whoever is the successor to the part of our church for whom, no, women in ministry is just as normative as men in ministry. The abortion issue is related both to sexuality and to gender, and definitely has been an issue that has continued to divide church and society. The other division, the other social issue that has been facing the nation, I'd say this is especially since the time of the Vietnam War, and also the church, at least since that time also, which is this narrative of American exceptionalism, America first, manifest destiny, that this is the promised land, versus all of the narratives that in some way have brought a critique to that and said, now wait, that narrative leaves these people out. And I'm going to talk a fair amount about that tonight, so I'm going to be circling back around to that. Race, sexuality, gender, and support for or critique of American exceptionalism. Those have been some of the issues that we've been struggling with in church and society, starting probably in the 1950s. For white Protestant Christianity, and for some of black Protestant Christianity, especially the historically black Methodist denominations, the ecumenical mainline churches and organizations have been replaced by evangelical mainline churches and organizations, which for 40 years now have defined what Christianity means in public life. Again, it just struck me in the last few months that I graduated seminary in 1981. For all of my active career in professional ministry, the Christian right, in some version, has become the dominant face of Protestant Christianity in a great part of the nation, in a way that in the 40s and 50s it certainly was not. And a subset of the evangelical mainline is what is also referred to as the Christian right or Christian nationalists. Those who really believe that the only valid United States is as a Christian nation. I believe the Christian right has been one major agent. I won't say it's the sole agent, that would be way too much, and leaves out social media and the way we play with it or mess with it and all kinds of other things. Christian right has been one major agent in driving political and religious polarization. I'd say both in church and society, in the fundamentalist turn to what in philosophy and the history of religion is called Manichaean religion. Remember, Manichaean religion comes from the Middle East, a couple hundred years. I can't remember if it's before Christ or after Christ, but some, ancient that way. I believe there were actually two gods. One, a God who created material things and matter, it was bad. And then another God of spirit, God good. So all things dark darkness was associated with bad. Lightness is associated with good. And there was a constant cosmic battle between these two co-equal powers that would eventually wind up in good triumphing. And again, I won't go into this evening, but in the history of Christianity and in the Judaism of Jesus' day, some of the Manichaean influence had already come into Judaism, and Satan becomes a figure representing evil. Remember in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, about the only place Satan shows up is in Job, where God says to his prosecuting attorney, things are great on the earth, aren't they? And the prosecuting attorney says, well, except for this one guy here that you've really favored way too much. And then the story goes on from there. Satan simply means the adversary. The evil, the devil with the horns and the pitchfork and the tail and all that, that's a much later, that's almost like Santa Claus. It's an invention of artists along the way. What we see in our culture is the children of light, the children of God, fighting against the children of darkness, those being the agents of Satan. This is the way that those on the religious right talk about the situation. And I would say that if they knew what I was saying tonight, would talk about me. I'm sure I'm now representing the father of lies in what I'm telling you. The Christian right seeks to purify the nation in the same way they purified their own institutions. Silencing and expulsion. So when it comes right down to, when you look at extreme polarization, what are the options? What's the end game? If you no longer have opponents, but what you have is enemies. If you don't have persons with sincerely held beliefs who deeply disagree, but what you have is somebody on the side of God and somebody on the side of Satan, what's the end game in a democratic republic? It comes down to something like you silence the other, or you convert the other, or you have to expel or exterminate the other. It's a very dangerous game. And I don't mean to use game as in like game theory, not as in, it's just playing. It's not just playing, it's really serious life and death kind of stuff. Since 1965 and the change in immigration laws, the U.S. has become more ethnically and religiously diverse than at any other time in our history. And by 2040, 2042, 2044, people who identify as white will no longer be the majority in the United States. There will be no racial ethnic majority by that time. In terms of babies being born now, the scales have already tipped to predominantly non-white. So the end of white Protestant dominance in America, in terms of numbers, is in sight. At the same time, we've become more ethnically and religiously diverse than any time in our history. It would seem to be a good place and time to deal with diversity. It would seem to. A record number of younger people reject all religious affiliation and their social justice preferences, higher support for some expressions of socialism, higher support for LGBTQ persons, and higher disposition toward gender fluidity themselves. These social justice preferences run counter to the Christian right. They also report a lower support for democracy than older generations. You know, and if all you've seen in your life of 18 years is democracy has been practiced in this country over the last 18 years, I have a good imagination for why somebody might say, yeah, democracy, is that really such a great thing? Seriously, I mean, think about lifespan here. Think about the people who didn't experience or get from their parents World War II. You know, what the country did during the Depression to make it through. What the country did during World War II, the sacrifices. What the big going to war against the evils of Nazism and the way that pulled people together with a clear enemy versus what has been experienced in this country over the last 18 years. I can understand why younger people might check on that box. Democracy, you know, we'll find other ways to do this. That's where we've been. That was the first 2 weeks. Kind of ring bells? All right, tonight, I want to look at what's the story we tell ourselves about who and what this nation has been, is, and should be. Just a small little task. I'm going to start with the personal narrative. All education is a sort of an awakening for me. I love schooling, I love reading, I love trying to learn. In his novel, In the Beginning, Chaim Potok has one of his characters reading in parks. He likes to have a book, to sit in a park and read. And somebody asked him, why do you like that? And he said, quote, to have the world visible so you can see how my reading has changed it. To have the world visible so you can see how your reading has changed it. My reading has changed the way I see the world. I grew up in Brookfield, Illinois, a western suburb of Chicago, about 10 miles from the city's downtown. Most Chicago area people knew Brookfield as the home of the zoo, including the first animal exhibits in the US surrounded by moats rather than cages, and the world's first inland dolphin show. Brookfield's diversity was expressed both in European descent and by, sorry, I'm going to do that again. Brookfield's diversity was expressed by basically what European country were you descended from. In terms of ethnic diversity, by the time we were in early elementary school, we all knew the national derivation of everybody's name. Peluso, Italy; Bly, Germany; Wisniewski, Poland; Adams, somewhere in Great Britain. And we all had dads with names like Emil, Elmer, or Adolf. Occasionally there would be somebody with the last name of Marks, M-A-R-K-S, and we didn't yet know that names were changed at Ellis Island and in the wake of the Holocaust or the Shoah, and that Marx probably was M-A-R-X originally and Jewish. Religious diversity was broadly Protestant or Catholic, and the big division was that the Catholic kids at the parochial school directly next to the public grade school were taught by the sisters not to associate with public school kids. Protestants thought of the Pope with at least as much suspicion as we thought of kings. an un-American carryover from the old country. In today's terms, Brookfield was overwhelmingly white, and defined over against neighboring Maywood with its large black population, and LaGrange, where there were actually black and white kids in the same high school. Not at mine. Brookfield was full of World War II veterans raising their families. The church-going population was high. Public schools celebrated Christmas and Easter breaks. Native Americans in history were simply the friendly Indians who taught the Plymouth colony how to grow corn, or the Indians who battled the cowboys for some unexplained reasons. The 4th of July parade was a big deal every year. I was taught to stand and place my hand over my heart whenever the flag passed. Later, scouting taught me more flag etiquette, and I still follow that etiquette today. I really hate it when I see some tattered flag flying perpetually over a car dealership. I'm like, take it down, burn it or bury it, do it properly. Reverence is a word I would have recognized as applicable to God and country. I was raised to believe that the U.S. is the greatest country in the world, superior to all other allies in safeguarding freedom, distinguished by our superior practice of democracy, and of a completely different species from godless communist countries, which had only one name on election ballots and one brand of toothpaste on their shelves. My dad always said that. They only have one of everything. In church, I was taught by word and example that being a Christian means striving to be a morally good person and help those who are at some disadvantage. I was in 7th grade when Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. I saw the news of what was happening in Chicago, but Brookfield was insulated, and I apparently was still rather asleep. During Vietnam draft, my older brother's draft number was 244, and he was not called to the service. So I and my family were able to live my white, middle-class, apolitical, God and country, privileged life basically all the way into college. I attended a small church-related college in southern Wisconsin, a lot like OCU, only in Wisconsin, with much better falls and much worse winters. While the college was white in many ways, it was not exclusively so. There was an active black students organization. So I got to know some black people in my courses in socialization and running track. But as a religion major, it was the religion courses that began to open me to a wider world that challenged the privileged ground on which I thought I stood. In particular, courses in the prophets and on Jesus. Learned that prophets were not those who were foretelling things century in advance, but were speaking truth to power to the kings and priests of their day, saying, "Thus says the Lord about what you're up to today. What you're doing is unjust. And if you keep going in this way, here's going to be the consequence of that." We learned about Jesus in the context of the Roman Empire and the risks he took in nearly anything he did. We learned about the requirement to interpret Scripture. We learned that there is no such thing as the Bible says without including the audience, the hearer's response of, well, this is what we think that meant, and therefore this is what we think it means, as an act of interpretation. For me, the Bible went from something which was personal to something that's personal and social. The Bible went from being privately read to communally interpreted, at least being in conversation with some other interpreters you were reading, if not actually with people you were struggling to figure out the meaning of this book together with. Now, Karl Barth's line about reading with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other began to make sense. Demanding questions then became how we interpret and relate the present with the church's book, especially as that book is understood through the perspectives of reading the prophets and Jesus. It was studying the Bible that caused me to be more aware and more critical of matters regarding faith and public life than I was before. Got a couple of slides to show you right at the start here about America's dominant story of itself. This is I should have printed that off. This is a painting. This is George Washington. And what's he got in his hand? Can't see it quite, but it's the Constitution. But he's being portrayed as who? Moses. George Washington, the new lawgiver. And that and a Roman general were two of the ways that the portraiture and the mythologizing around Washington took its shape. This is not the seal of the United States, but it's the seal that Thomas Jefferson wanted. Because of the Getty Images logo in here, it's a little hard to see. So here's the front of the seal. The scene that's here is Moses and the children of Israel just having crossed over to the other side of the Red Sea. Here's the pillar of fire that's been leading them. Here's Pharaoh's charioteers being drowned in the sea. Shows from the Exodus story. And it says around here, rebellion to tyrants owes obedience to God. Jefferson and Franklin both wanted that as the front of the Great Seal of the United States. Interesting, no? Okay. The back of the seal, this is even more interesting to me. And these two things play together. Those two are the founders of the Anglo-Saxon race. Because Jefferson said the Anglo-Saxon race is the race from which we have derived our laws. It's the purest race that has ever been on this planet. He puts together the Exodus and a continuation of the Anglo-Saxon race. And you have to read Jefferson in context. And I really, one book I would encourage, a number of books I encourage you to read. If you're a reader, because this is a serious book. Jill Lepore, I think it's Lepore, professor at Harvard. It's a new history of the United States in one volume. It was published back in September, called These Truths. Best book on American history I've ever read, by far. I can't tell you the number of things I think, boy, she included it, and from what I know, got this right. Read Jefferson, read Washington. It's a little different than it's different. It's different from what I got in high school, college, and so many other places. Not that it contradicted facts, but a number of facts were included, a number of quotes included, which gave me quite a different perspective. So that this, as the combination that Jefferson appealed to Jefferson, made perfect sense to me now. The other picture I want to show you as I start out here, it's a very famous painting by Thomas Gast, G-A-S-T, 1872, called American Progress. Now, see if any historians here in the bunch. Do you know who she is? Before there was Lady Liberty, there was Columbia. Most nations, most European nations, had some feminine representation of the nation. Columbia is the feminine of Columbus. And you know Columbia Pictures? You know, that's Columbia, folks. That's another version of Columbia. This is Columbia. So she's the representation of America with the star in her crown. looking very much like a what? An angel. Carrying a book, by the way, that says, you can't see it in there, it says Common Education. And you see this painting. Light where she's been coming from, darkness where she's going. On the ground, what you see is there's civilization behind her. There's a port, there's a bridge, there are boats. There's more developed transportation coming, trains. She in her arm here has telegraph wires that she's stringing as she's bringing communication along the way. And then you have more primitive forms of transportation here, the Conestoga wagon, the carriage, right? Here you see some farmers plowing the ground with oxen and by hand. Settlers, this is all sort of time frame. You go, this is the frontier, right? She's bringing light and education to the frontier, and who's being driven off? The Native Americans, and up here's the buffalo. The wilderness is being driven off, and you don't see anybody in this picture, and this is not unintentional. You don't see anybody in this picture who's not white, other than the people being driven off their lands. This was a very publicized photo during that, but most people also comment, now how's that dress staying on? Anglo-Saxon? American progress? This particular painting is seen as one of the most widely circulated representations of the myth of manifest destiny, which I'm going to be talking about quite a bit this evening. I think we Christians need to reject the story portrayed in American Progress. The story of exodus from British bondage for freedom to live in a promised land of liberty and justice for all does not ring true for indigenous peoples. It does not ring true for many African Americans. It does not ring true for many other persons of color. It does not ring true for some white Americans. It does not ring true for religious minorities. And as a Christian, and coming from the way I read the meaning of Christianity because of the way I read the Bible, it does not ring true for me. Some critics of religion and public life might object to any use of biblical narrative or story to bring meaning, to define belonging, to shape our moral sense, or to empower us. Remember the things I've been talking about: meaning, belonging, moral sense, empowering. Some critics might say, it's time to just drop all the religion out of public life, strip it out. But I'm going to argue that the biblical story of the Exodus is one story that might continue to be a powerful option from which to develop a national story that includes all of those for whom the American Progress Manifest Destiny narrative does not ring true. The story of God hearing the suffering of an oppressed people and taking their side against an oppressive system is both timeless and transcultural. But I'm going to locate my answer to what time is it and what should we then do in a different part of that story than the promised land narratives do. In relocating where America is at, and arguably where Christian churches should be, I'm going to acknowledge my debt to black theology, from which decades ago I gained the perspective that America was, and for some African Americans still is, Egypt, rather than the promised land. So let's recall the Exodus story. The scenes in that story include, there's captivity, there was Moses demanding the release of the children of Israel, and then the upping the pain in the plagues. There's the Exodus per se, getting out of the land, getting up to the what scholars call the Sea of Reeds rather than the Red Sea these days, and the destruction of Pharaoh's army. Then there's the wilderness, that, according to the Bible, that period of 40 years. And I know Muzan taught this, I know David teaches this, I know all the pastors have taught this. 40 does not equal a set, actual, literal, calendar, pages, turn number. 40 in the Bible means a time of testing, a substantial time of testing. And we're going to talk about that. Wilderness, a time of wandering, law-giving, conflict, and training. And then after the wilderness comes the conquest and the possession of the promised land. For the American story, America chose to be the promised land, the city set on a hill, the chosen nation, God's own people. All of these titles, drawn from the Bible, applied to national life, fed the myth of manifest destiny. That God willed for Anglo-Saxon, Christian, Protestant men to gain dominion over the land from coast to coast. If you read the histories and read the quotes, I am not exaggerating or excluding anybody from this, that God willed Anglo-Saxon, Christian, Protestant men to gain dominion. That myth was employed first to go to war with Mexico for Texas. That myth was used along with two legal positions with high affinity with the myth of manifest destiny, to remove native peoples from their ancestral lands. How many of you have heard of the doctrine of discovery? The doctrine of discovery originates in a papal bull, a papal pronouncement in 1493. What happened in 1492? Ooh, other lands, which gave Pope, get this, the Pope gave European Catholic monarchs, they were all Catholics at that point, the authority to conquer discovered lands in the name of Christianity and to bring the people there forcibly into the Christian fold. Now, this is the part that was less, you have to look this up to really, we did this? The papal bull then became a tradition amongst Europeans coming here. That tradition was used in 1823 by Justice John Marshall as one of the reasons to dispossess native people from their land, and making the declaration that indigenous peoples had occupancy rights, but no longer ownership rights. Those belonged to the conquerors. The second legal piece that comes into this comes from British common law, English common law, vacuum domicilium, vacant lands. If lands were unfenced and without European-type buildings on the lands, they could be declared vacant and taken by any person who would develop that land according to European standards of development. Manifest Destiny is an Anglo-Saxon supremacist narrative built on the alleged racial superiority of Anglo-Saxon peoples to any other on the planet, and judging all other peoples compared to how akin they are to Anglo-Saxons. And white Christianity and white Christians have both gotten sucked into that narrative and promoted that narrative. Native peoples were more than decimated with the blessing of this Christian supercharged narrative of manifest destiny. Africans were enslaved and then subjected to black codes and Jim Crow and mass incarceration via the blessing of this narrative. Some Christian denominations, including our own, have renounced the doctrine of discovery. United Methodist Church renounced the doctrine of discovery some years ago now. It's in our social principles. I believe it's also time for Christians to rebuke, renounce, and repent from the myth of manifest destiny. Our way forward as a nation is not to suppress the histories that conflict with the story portrayed in American progress. The way forward is not going to be found in defending and reinvigorating that narrative. The way forward can appear only when we expand the scope of who is included in our story and when we together can own the whole story. Now, in my wildest, most hopeful moments, wouldn't Oklahoma be a perfect test case for expanding in our story? We have a unique history here of indigenous people, of what this place has meant for Black Americans, for white Americans, for more recently for the Vietnamese and the Burmese and the Korean and the Chinese who have come here. For all of the countries represented by the state's mosque, I forget how many, it's like 30 or 40 or 50 nations all worship together in the mosque here in Tulsa. Mexican and Central American persons, urban and rural persons. That's one of the big divisions in our state, right? Between urban and rural. It's actually one of the big divisions of the country right now. You keep, parsing out the 2016 election, and urban-rural in 2018 showed up again. Urban-rural, huge, huge challenge there. In Oklahoma, we have Christians and Jews and Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, persons of other faiths, and persons with no religious affiliation, just like the country has. More Christians than the rest of the country has, but we could actually be part of the solution. We have everything in this town from All Souls to Rhema, from St. George's Orthodox to Metro Baptist, and everything in between. So what is a religiously meaningful narrative that could provide a home, a moral compass, and a sense of empowerment for all the peoples of our state, for all the peoples in the U.S.? I used to think the narrative might be of exile, slightly later in Israel's history, where there's after the Promised Land and after they have been taken into captivity in Babylon and the like. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, a name familiar to at least some of us in this room, has written elegantly and several times on the theme of exile, that all of us in the contemporary world of rapid change feel ourselves in some form of exile, like we've been removed from our home and we're trying to find a way back. But then I noticed how the Christian right referred to the 8 years of the Obama administration as their time of living in exile, and how President Trump has returned them to their homeland. And there's the ongoing narrative in Black theology, as I mentioned earlier, that the U.S. has not been the Promised Land. The most skeptical have said this land will never be other than Egypt. And the most hopeful, represented most memorably by Dr. King, that this is not the Promised Land yet, but it could be. Let's turn back to the Exodus. Remember the scenes again: captivity, demanding release, upping the pain, the Exodus and the destruction of Pharaoh's army, the wilderness, wandering, law-giving, conflict and training in freedom, conquest, possession of the land. Now, when you look at those scenes, actually, for the U.S. ever to have claim in our mythic foundings that we are in the possession of the Promised Land scene, there are problems with that story. As I've said, there have always been problems with this story for African Americans. This is a land of captivity, clearly. For Native peoples, they were more like the Canaanites who got conquered. If we were to do the Exodus, play this out in the Exodus story, not Promised Land. Note too that where the conquest is in relation to the Exodus is quite different, because We had the conquest of native peoples before the Revolution. We had the conquest of the British during the Revolution, which is what the Jefferson seal was portraying, that part of it. And then after the Revolution, there was the conquest of all of the lands to the west. The exodus per se from the British English control freed them to live in a land they already occupied. It wasn't this is the land of our captivity, and now we're going to travel to a land of our own. No, they took control of, it was like taking control of Egypt in that sense. And I would also say, history has shown that the colonists in the new nation really created another form of Egypt with different overseers, because it was a class of rulers and a class of those who were subjugated, which I think was Egypt, not the freedom promise of the promised land. So this is my proposal. How about this for a retelling? If we keep in sight the histories of the various peoples who came to the Americas, who were taken to the Americas, and whose people lived in the Americas for thousands of years before Europeans arrived and brought enslaved Africans with them. If we keep in sight that America today is populated by the most racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse population we've ever had, and arguably that ever has been in any complex society in the face of the earth, and when we consider that the myth of manifest destiny has supported the superiority of white Christians over all other peoples, then I think we must declare the narrative of manifest destiny is bankrupt. That narrative ignores and suppresses too much history and is being used today to defend a promised land mentality for an increasingly small number of Americans. However, the desires to build a nation of self-governing persons, each recognized in law and society as a human being, endowed with conscience and dignity, and with a responsibility to respect the conscience and dignity of their fellow citizens. To build a nation where each works for a society which respects life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness reciprocally for everyone. These remain very powerful and very admirable desires, worthy of our time and attention. Well, what is the narrative that the U.S. needs today that might lead to that sort of more inclusive vision of a nation? Let us acknowledge the founders did not build the nation we need today. They threw off their English overlords and celebrated God's blessings of America, while turning the U.S. into a new version of Egypt for some of the people here. They were served by enslaved persons or benefited from slave labor. They conquered and nearly exterminated indigenous peoples. They originally limited democracy rather tightly, first property white men, while writing elegantly about democracy's virtues. Over decades and then for more than 2 centuries, elected leaders were pressured to extend the franchise to more and more circles of people, which is good. The U.S. is not a promised land and never has been. We do not live in a promised land under attack that needs to be made first again. Rather, referring to the scenes from the biblical Exodus, it is the wilderness in which we find ourselves today. That we as a collective we. None of us in the U.S. lives in a promised land. We are all in the wilderness. Oh yes, there are calls to return to the comforts and privileges and power structures of Egypt that were presented as the promised land. This is the narrative of manifest destiny, most strongly championed today by the Christian right and by white nationalists. It is a narrative that must be rebuked and from which Christians, I think, should repent and try again. In the wilderness, the old rules and the old narrative do not work. In the U.S. version of the wilderness, the descendants of the enslaved persons and descendants of slaveholders, descendants of those who took the land and those from whom the land was taken, we're all out here together. That's our starting point. However we got here, we're in this wilderness together. We really don't yet know how we're going to live with each other. In the Bible, consider what the wilderness was, and think as you hear these things, how many of these experiences are common in our culture today, how common in our churches today. In the Bible, the wilderness was first uncomfortable. You've heard the difference between change and transition. Change is the physical relocation of one thing to another, in one place to another. Change is moving from Chicago to Tulsa. Change is a forecast that says we're going to get 3 inches of snow and then you get half an inch of rain. That's change. Transition is everything that happens between your ears. Spouse dies. That's a change. It's a bigger transition. You retire, or you go on sabbatical for a year and never having done that. That's a change, but the transition requires a lot of mental energy. William Bridges, who has written extensively about change and transition, says, in business, when you do your strategic plan and you have your change plan all laid out, you know what wrecks most strategic change plans? It's people didn't allow the sufficient time to deal with transition. In the Bible, the wilderness was full of conflict. There was conflict between those who wanted to move forward and those who wanted to go back. And conflict among people who said, there's just not enough for everyone out here. Does that sound familiar to anyone? This is where we're at today. In the Bible, the wilderness was fraught with ambiguities and much anxiety. And the crazy-making behavior that accompanies anxiety. Anybody who's ever tried to manage change before, you know that one of the other factors that makes or breaks the success in managing that change is, how did you manage people's anxieties? Because when you do change, you're going to have anxiety. Aren't we in a highly anxious period today? Yes. In the Bible, the wilderness was marinated in fear. Mostly in, have we got the right leadership here and are we going to ever get to the other side? Does that sound familiar to anyone today? In the Bible, the wilderness was a space and a time with a whole lot of unlearning to do and a whole lot of learning that needed to take place. Why that 40-year period? That's one of my favorite jokes. Well, Moses was leading and he was a man, he didn't want to ask for directions, right? Now, it's 40 years because people needed to get Egypt out of their cultural habits. They were raised slaves. They had to learn how to live free, including how to exercise freedom within the context of their responsibilities to God and to people who were their neighbors. In the Bible, the wilderness was a place where they had to face the possibility, in which they had, of one or more rebellions and of cohorts of people breaking off to find their own way out because they don't want to make this journey with the others that are there with them. Sound like a place we're in today? It does to me. Now think about the leadership needs of these two different scenarios, of the more manifest destiny and defending that versus if we're in the wilderness together. Think if we're defending threats to our promised land, or living for an indeterminate time, which is really what that 40 years means, with the promised land being probably a new way to live where we are, rather than traveling physically to a new place. So in other words, transition work. If you're defending threats and you're looking for a leader, you want a strong man. You allow the strong man a great deal of authority to keep the beasts of chaos at bay. This is classic Thomas Hobbes. We'll sacrifice our freedom to put somebody strong in place to defend us from what the evil beasts are out there. We will play on nostalgia. There was a past golden era from which the wrong-headed children of darkness led us astray. We should plug the holes in the narrative walls by silencing histories in our textbooks that do not support our story. We suppress the vote among populations that might challenge the power base that supports that story. But what if you're looking for leadership for that indeterminate time spent together in the wilderness, trying to figure out together how to be the people that you've not yet been, but you really want to be? Well, then you're going to probably look for somebody who can create a holding environment. Holding environment is a term that actually comes from a counselor's office. Counselors will say, you want to create a safe space. Use a lot of different ways before today. When counselors talk about it, they say, we want to create a safe space so that the dangerous stuff that you're afraid of dealing with can emerge here, and we can deal with it. That's a holding environment. It's creating tables and doing everything possible to keep diverse parties at the tables so that the dangerous stuff can emerge in a place with enough safety you can actually deal with it. Because that's the only way we're going to learn and form common ground together. If you're looking for a leader for indeterminate amount of time in the wilderness, you need somebody who says, I know we're going to have to deal with fears and anxieties. And it seems to me most religious traditions I know have something to say about dealing with our fears and anxieties. If you're looking for a leader for indeterminate time to bring us through the wilderness, you're going to need somebody who can deal with conflict. As in, help people have productive conflicts. Because conflicts are not going to go away. That's not the point. The point is, can you conflict productively? Can you actually come to some sort of managed resolution of it, rather than, can I keep this place, get this place so pure that only people like me think here, live here? If you're looking for a leader for indeterminate time, you need someone who can keep the vision, the goal, the hope in front of people in as vivid a way as possible while you celebrate little victories along the way. Because you don't know how long you're going to be out here, and you don't want to put off all your celebrations until you get there. If you're looking for a leader for indeterminate time in the wilderness, you need someone who is skilled in how to do, and I think that this is really something that this last one is the one that I have my eyes peeled for right now, because I think this is one of the places where, as a church, as well as a nation, I see so little of this going on. It's so risky. Skilled in how to do public versions of confession, penance, and forgiveness. I'm hearing a lot of confessions recently. I'm hearing claims of, either demands you must do penance, or a person saying I will do penance. But I'm not hearing much on the forgiveness one. I'm really wondering if the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa isn't something that, I know people in this country have taken a look at those, but I'm really wondering if some localized context, proper version of that isn't what needs to be in front of us as a people. Because one of the things you're dealing with in the wilderness, as I mentioned a bit ago, is that those who manifest destiny served well, and those who manifest destiny ignored or harmed, we're all in the wilderness camps together. How are we going to get over the fact that we came from very different places here, but we need to move, if we're going to be together as a people, how do we find a way to do that together? Now you may say, well, figuring out how to do all this stuff together is not much of a national purpose. And it doesn't quite drive and sing in the same way that Manifest Destiny might have. Well, you're probably right. I can do some things marketing-wise. I can't do this one. But step back with me. Again, what's the biggest perspective we can get here? What do you consider to be the biggest global challenges facing humankind, not just the United States today? Think through yours as I say mine. I'm just about concluded here. Number one for me is the sustainability and health of planet Earth. I just have to figure if this world rises by 3 or 4 degrees by the end of this century, every problem we're facing today is a different problem than that. Is different from that. A sustainable and healthy planet with clean air, clean water, and live soil. We don't have those things. I mean, if you don't have live soil, actually, everything on Earth dies. Everything dies. And the chemicals we put into the ground these are not sustainable things. They just aren't. Sustainability and health planet Earth, number one. Human rights and respect for human dignity, number 2. The rest of these are not in order, priority order. How are we going to achieve as much prosperity and fairness in global commerce as we can? We're all connected together. Wow, internet has done a spectacular job of that. And Amazon and everybody's, and Alibaba's and other distribution facilities have done a spectacular job at that. Okay, so now prosperity and fairness. How are we going to deal with fear? There's a lot of fear in this world. There's that question, I think, that most of our religions are going to have something to do. Who's my neighbor? As far as I'm concerned, one of Jesus' main teachings is whoever you think your neighbor is, that circle's actually bigger than you got to imagine right now. And how do we negotiate life agreements between opposing parties? And I'm not saying win-win, because I'd rather make it clear that there's life, and life-death. When you're dealing globally, when you're dealing with really big issues, when you're dealing with the really important stuff, win-win just doesn't get at the same thing, because winning, well, you lost this time. No, because a lot of times what you're dealing with is a life and death issue. Again, coming out of before entering the promised land, remember what Moses and the people was told to tell the people? Choose life. I lay before you this day a choice between death and life. Choose life. Man, I think that's powerful for us in our world right now. Those are the huge global problems. Manifest destiny, as applied to the United States, is not going to help get this planet to where the planet needs to be. It will not get the U.S. to what our role should be in meeting those global challenges, even for our own citizens. And I don't think, again, it's a narrative that any Christian should support. For closing off, what I'm going to say tonight, I'm going to say, remember what the word Exodus means. It means the way out.